And my first question is about your recent current researches. Can you tell us, please, a little what are you researching now? As far as I understand, in recent years, you do a lot of research on Arabic philosophy and the reception of Greek philosophers in the Arabic philosophical tradition. Do you?
Yes, I'm still working with a couple of colleagues, one from Myriam Septi of Paris and Jules Janssens of Belgium. And we're trying to produce a new critical edition with translation and commentary of a very little known work by the Islamic philosopher Ibn Sina, otherwise known as Avicenna. He wrote a commentary, or rather a collection of notes, more like, on this strange Arabic work known as the Theology of Aristotle. The Theology of Aristotle, contrary to its name, has nothing to do with Aristotle. It is in fact an Arabic translation with a lot of intercalations and commentaries of extracts from the last 3 Enneads of Plotinus. So this strange work, which presented, went under the name of Aristotle, but nevertheless presented a Neoplatonic worldview and metaphysics, Avicenna commented on it, and he has an awful lot of trouble trying to reconcile these doctrines, these obviously Neoplatonic doctrines, such as the pre-existence of the soul, with its alleged authorship by Aristotle. So it's an underexplored and very interesting example of the interactions of Greek and Islamic thought.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. I have a few more questions about your researches on Arabic Islamic thought and Arabic philosophical texts, but I think I will ask it later. Mm-hmm. In a paper you published in the book of essays in honor of Pierre Hadot, you described how you got acquainted with philosophy at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, I believe. Yes.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And it was an analytical philosophy, and although you found some parts of it useful, for example, as you write logic and some methods of argumentation and so on, nevertheless, analytical philosophy pushed you away because it was, again, as you write, monumentally boring, dry, abstract, and full of scarcely comprehensible considerations. Yes. At the same time, Pierre Hadot, whose books you discovered later, is known for his love for Ludwig Wittgenstein, probably one of the most famous analytical philosophers, whose famous Tractatus Logica Philosophicus Hadot even called a spiritual exercise. Yes. So the question is, after reading Hadot and acquaintance with him, have you reassessed your assessment of analytical philosophy in general and Ludwig Wittgenstein in particular?
Oh, it's a very interesting question. Yeah, I think that essay you're mentioning is actually rather old now, and I was rather young and impetuous and perhaps a bit too one-sided. I think it's unfair to present analytic philosophy as some kind of a monolithic creature which has one set of characteristics that all analytic philosophers obey or conform to. In the time since I wrote that article in the late 1990s, analytical philosophy has, in fact, started to deal more with metaphysical questions and to ask some of the kinds of the so-called big questions that I accused it of neglecting. So why are we here? Why is there something rather than nothing? What is the meaning of life? And so forth and so on. So the gap, I think, between analytic and non-analytic philosophy is perhaps not as, what shall I say, not as unbreakable, not as uncrossable as I presented it then. But I still think that there is a certain amount of a sort of an analytic, or one might speak of a neo-positivistic attitude, which I don't find as attractive personally as I do Hadot's approach.
Mm.
As far as Wittgenstein is concerned, I think we should distinguish between Wittgenstein himself and what has been made of him later. What attracted Pierre Hadot to Wittgenstein was a couple of main concepts. One was his notion of language games, which Hadot very fruitfully applied to the study of ancient philosophy by saying that in order to understand ancient thought, we simply have to understand the context in which each ancient work was written, because each author is constrained by the language games of his literary genre. He cannot say anything anywhere. To some extent, he is constrained by the kind of works that he is writing. So that was a very fruitful principle, I think. The other, of course, was Hadot's interest in mysticism. That's why I believe he was the first French writer actually to become interested in Wittgenstein, the first to write on him in the early 1960s. And what he was especially interested in was the idea, Wittgenstein's dictum, that es gibt das Mystische, the mystical exists. And the other famous writings, of course, that about remaining silent about what we cannot speak about. So I think that Hadot was most interested in Wittgenstein because of Wittgenstein's concentration on the limits of language, on the relation between language and thought, on the way language may condition our thought, and on the way language may, to a certain extent and in certain contexts, impede us in our understanding of aspects of reality that may not be graspable by language of any kind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks.
So yeah, I think Wittgenstein himself is a lot richer for me and more interesting than, if in fact inexhaustibly so, than a lot of what his positivistic interpreters have used. In other words, just he's often been cited as a pretext for simply dismissing any discussion of metaphysics, for instance, as nonsense, and the verifiability criterion of meaningfulness. Simply, any statement that we can't verify is strictly meaningless. I'm sorry, which strikes me as absurd.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, agreed. Can we speak a little bit more about Hadot and about your impression about him? Because I know when Pierre Hadot passed away, you wrote an obituary, but unfortunately not everyone in Russia freely reads in English. But Hadot is very popular among Russians. For example, I have some of his books. It is Philosophy as a Way of Life, a collection of his interviews, I believe, with Arnold Davidson, yes, and
Jeanne Carlier.
Yeah. And the second one is Spiritual Exercises and Ancient Philosophy. And I did have more books. His book on Plotinus, I don't know its title in French or English, Simplicity of View in Russian. Yes, and his book, general book on ancient philosophy. So I'm going to translate I hope our conversation into Russian in printed form. So could you please share with the Russian audience few memories about Hadot? For example, what impression did Hadot make on you when you was young and when you first came to him from Canada to France?
Yes, well, of course, as you say, I was young at the time and very intimidated because at the time, Pierre Hadot was one of the most eminent scholars in France. By that time, he had been elected to the Collège de France on the recommendation of Michel Foucault. And that's the epitome, that's the highest you can get in French academia. You don't professor at the Collège de France. So I met him and I was terrified, of course. But what I encountered in him was someone who was completely unassuming, without any arrogance, without any, almost all of his conversation was punctuated by jokes at his own expense. He liked to make fun of himself a lot. He just did not take himself too seriously. And that was remarkable to me. I couldn't understand how such a great man whose works I had so carefully pored over every single word could be so modest. And I think that that's what basically, ever since, throughout my life since then, it's been one of those experiences that marked me, because I don't know if you've had this experience, but often the books that one reads, one really likes, one really admires, one tends to make a hero out of the author. And one thinks, oh gosh, if only I could meet that person. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Well, I've done that 2 or 3 times. And 9 times out of 10, one finds that when one does meet the author in person, it's not quite what one would expect. One is not necessarily so impressed when one meets the person, because perhaps they're arrogant, perhaps they say, oh no, don't bother me now, son, I'm too busy, etc. That's a very common response by these great men in commas. But here, in the person of Pierre Hadot, I met somebody who practiced what he preached. When he speaks in the book you mentioned of the life of on Plotinus, he speaks of Plotinus's main characteristic as being open, both to himself and to others. And that's exactly what was true with Pierre Hadot. He treated everyone with the same kindness and the same attentiveness. There's an example of this one. I'll cite an anecdote. One time I was invited, he invited me and my wife and about 5 or 6 other people to lunch at the Collège de France. So we were all dressed up in our suits and our ties, and we all waited outside his office. He came out and we were about to go to a restaurant, but in the meantime, he saw a very young couple sort of looking lost in the corridor. So he walked over to them and asked them if he could help them. And they said, well, yes, we're looking for the cafeteria. Oh, he said, fine, I'll take you there. So he wasn't content with saying it's down the hall. He said, I'll take you there. So he walked them all the way down to the cafeteria, which is quite a ways away, leaving the 7 of us standing there in the courtyard twiddling our thumbs. But we just had to wait because Hadot was busy helping out these complete strangers. And that was what was important then. And we would just have to wait.
Yeah, great story. Yeah, thanks for these memories. In the same paper, in the book, in the honor of Pierre Hadot, you wrote that we need some kind of typology of spiritual exercises, as well as contributions from psychologists and some cognitive scientists. And in your more recent article, Pierre Hadot and his critics on spiritual exercises and cosmic consciousness, you draw very interesting parallels with the trend of thought called neural Buddhism, associated with prominent neurologist James Austin. Could you please tell us more about points of convergence between spiritual exercises and neural Buddhism?
Mm-hmm. First of all, just maybe a word or two about what I understand by neural Buddhism. Perhaps that expression is too narrow. I think there's an emerging discipline right now, which is called contemplative studies. And that it's based on findings that have been discovered by means of carrying out measurements of the brain activity of experienced meditators. And trying to mine those studies to find out exactly what goes on in our mind when we meditate. And some very interesting findings have taken place, including that, meaning long-term meditators, the practice of various forms of meditation can actually change the structure of the brain. It can make some parts of our brain larger. It can make all kinds of permanent changes, physical changes in the brain, which sort of gives the lie to all those who claim, oh, well, we can't really change ourselves. We can't transform our lives the way Pierre Hadot says that spiritual exercises should do, that all philosophy should ultimately do. For Pierre Hadot, all philosophy, whether ancient or modern, to be worthy of the name, should be transformative. It should actually change, should not just be a matter of publishing, of making us think, oh gosh, that's an interesting idea, and then closing the book and going on to live the way we did before. It should change our lives. And if it doesn't, then it's not true philosophy. But the objection is frequently raised, well, we're hardwired to be the way we are. We can't change. And that seems to be incorrect. And some of these studies of neural Buddhism and contemplative studies seem to show that we actually can, quote unquote, rewire our brains to a certain extent by simply carrying out activities that are intellectual, imaginative practices, which are very close to what Pierre Hadot called spiritual exercises. So what I was struck by, Pierre Hadot himself was not interested at all in mindfulness. I really was only beginning to become popular in his time. He had some slight interest in meditation and in Oriental philosophy in general. But I think that if I have been able to contribute to the development of Pierre Hadot's thought in any way, I think it's by becoming interested in these what I think are very striking parallels between the findings of contemplative studies and Pierre Hadot's findings. For just to take a very quick example, one of the attitudes of one of the findings, the teachings of mindfulness, is that we shouldn't allow ourselves to be too reactive. We shouldn't allow ourselves to be triggered by emotions and thoughts, and what the English expression speaks of knee-jerk reactions. You know, when a doctor hits your knee and your foot goes up automatically. Unthinking ways in which we allow ourselves to be triggered by events and by things that people say and so forth. Instead, Greco-Roman philosophy, according to Pierre Hadot, teaches us to pause. And before we think, before we accept our first impressions, according to the discipline of assent and Stoicism, before we confirm and accept any sense presentation we have, any idea that we have to weigh it and decide, is this really true? Does this really correspond to reality? Is it objective? And that pause between having an impression and reacting to it is extremely important in Stoicism. Well, it's just as important in mindfulness. The idea that ultimately we should try to become detached from our thoughts rather than just assuming automatically that they're true. So I think that what mindfulness in this respect and Stoicism and Hadot's interpretation share is this concern for autonomy. We want to be free. It's a good thing to be free. But freedom doesn't just mean the absence of external oppression. It also means being free from being swayed by your own first impressions and thoughts and emotions. Often the way that we react in the first instance to phenomena or to things that we read or things that we hear is automatic and unthinking, and is often the results of tendencies that are extraneous. Our society, our culture, our education, things that our friends say and think, and now overwhelmingly the things that we experience in social media, the information we get from social media. So when we react immediately and are triggered by something we see online, for instance, there's a sense in which we're not being autonomous. We're allowing ourselves to be swept away by this stream of information, much of which is, of course, intentionally designed to do precisely that, to entail our assent before we have any time to think about it at all. So, so the idea of mindfulness is when we have strong emotions, before we react to them, before we allow ourselves to be swept away by them unthinkingly, we are to analyze them, we are to weigh them, we are to study the impact that these thoughts and ideas have on us before we react to us and express our reactions. So I think that's just one example of the senses in which there are these remarkable parallels, which are all the more remarkable, I think, in the case of Pierre Hadot and James Austin, whom he mentioned, the Buddhist, the doctor and Buddhist practitioner, is because they had never heard of one another. They never cite one another at all. They had not read each other's works, and yet they come to some strikingly similar conclusions in complete independence. For instance, in one of the articles that you mentioned, I point out how often both of these authors, Hadot and Austin, speak about the importance of objectivity. Objectivity is an extremely important idea for Pierre Hadot. This notion of it's the goal precisely of the discipline of assent. We don't allow ourselves to assent to any ideas unless we can be sure that they're objective, that they provide us with an accurate presentation of reality, with all our prejudices and preconceptions put aside for the moment. And likewise, James Austin, when he speaks about the mystical experience of Kensho in Zen Buddhism, and he searches for a term to describe that experience, the best, he tells us, the best explanation he can come up with is that it was objective. He saw reality the way it was for the first time. And sometimes scholars of Zen Buddhism speak in this context of suchness. It is seeing the world such as it is, no more, no less.
Yeah, thanks. And so do we need to create maybe some kind of new discipline, neural ancient philosophy?
Absolutely. Well, that's a wonderful idea. Yes, absolutely, absolutely. That would be very desirable to do. Now, of course, that such a discipline would be contradictory in a certain sense, because I think it's unlikely that we're going to be able to measure the brain waves of Epictetus as he teaches his class. I think probably the best that we could do is to study more of these parallels between some of the things that the Stoics teach, for instance, and some of the things that various Buddhist thinkers teach. I think they're remarkable. And there are, of course, when you find cross-cultural parallels like that, there's all kinds of different ways of explaining them. One can be by influence. And I've suggested sometimes that it looks as though the Greek skeptic thinker Pyrrho of Elis actually traveled to India and may have been influenced by Buddhist thought. And there may have been Buddhist influence on Islam as well. So that's one channel of influence, if you will, by diffusion. Contact between people, they talk and they get influenced by each other's ideas. But I think in a lot of these cases, we have to do with parallel developments that are done without any cultural contact between the people. So when we find parallels like that, I think they're even more interesting because they might tell us something about human nature, about the structure of the human brain. I've sometimes even toyed with the idea, and here I hope my Islamic readers will not be offended, that when in Islam, one subject of religious meditation is, of course, the doctrine of the Tawheed, the doctrine of unity. There is no God but Allah. And I'm wondering if that might be traceable in some sense or another to the idea of avoiding distraction in meditation. When Buddhists, for instance, teach us that to meditate means quieting the mind, concentrating on the breathing, to the exclusion of any other thought, well, that's kind of similar to the doctrine of the unicity of God in Islam, when one thinks only of God and one thinks of nothing else. It's haram. It's not permitted to think of, to associate anything with God. So what ultimately Islamic prayer, and for that matter, Neoplatonic prayer too, which is similar in this respect, focuses on unity and denies or rejects or sets aside multiplicity, which is considered only apparent. So in that sense, in other words, these techniques of avoiding distraction, of contemplating on unity, may have been discovered independently to be quite beneficial for our spiritual and our physical health. And that may be why they appear in very, very different contexts in cross-culturally, in different times and periods.
Mm-hmm. Yes, let's speak a little more about these cross-cultural parallels, because I have a question about particular parallel about which you write in your article, Did Socrates Meditate? So you write in that article that Socrates may have engaged in a practice that has features in common with meditative practices attested in Zen Buddhism. And it seems to me that for most students of ancient philosophy, this is a rather shocking statement, because, you know, most historians of ancient philosophy do not like such cross-cultural parallels, because where on the one hand is Socrates, one of the founding fathers of the European rationalistic philosophy and so on, and where on the other hand is Zen Buddhism, which is as far as we can imagine from the Western philosophical tradition. So can you speak, please, a little more about these parallels between Socrates' philosophical practices and Zen Buddhism meditation?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's only a couple of passages, and of course, we have to take into account that when our information about Socrates is very limited. He wrote nothing himself, so we have only a handful of accounts, basically by Plato, Xenophon, and Aristophanes, and they all present very different pictures of Socrates. So it's very difficult to know, when Plato describes what Socrates is doing, how much we should take that seriously and how much is just Plato's invention. But there are a couple of passages, particularly in the Phaedo, when Socrates is presented as lost in thought. The famous anecdote where he stands, he's on campaign in a war, and he astonishes his fellow soldiers by standing in a completely fixed position for 24 hours, frontis donte in Greek, thinking about something, running something over in his mind. Okay, well, what's going on there precisely? What exactly is Socrates thinking about? We can't know, of course. First of all, we can't know whether this anecdote is true. And then if it is true, we don't know what he was thinking about. But other passages in the Phaedo, Plato's dialogue, the Phaedo, seem to imply that Socrates did have some kind of a notion about meditation viewed as a practice of unification. He speaks in an odd way about joining together the soul, gathering together the soul, which is dispersed throughout our limbs. That's hard to understand, because how can something immaterial be dispersed throughout our limbs? But anyway, Socrates apparently knows of a practice whereby one gathers together the soul from its dispersed limbs, and one concentrates it into a center. Now that is an awful lot like what one hears in some Zen accounts of meditation, where that's precisely what one does by monitoring the breath. One gathers the breath from the different parts of the body, and one concentrates it in the center. But that, I've argued in the paper that you mentioned, I think that may be only the first stage. This might be a kind concentrate that might correspond, I'm sorry, to the kind of Zen Buddhist meditation known as samatha, which is concentrative. It involves the focusing of our attention on a specific object, and that can be the breath, that can be a mantra, that can be a spot on the wall, but it involves this intense focusing of our attention in order to eliminate all other distractions and considerations. But that can often be, in many Buddhist techniques, that can often be only the prelude to a second movement, which is more expansive. After we carry out that initial concentrative, what we might even call a sort of a deep entering within ourselves, this absorption within ourselves, which can lead to a literal state of absorption in which we're no longer aware of our external circumstances. And then I think is maybe what's going on when Socrates is meditating for 24 hours. After that, one opens up, one engages in another different kind of meditation, which, as in contrast with focused attention meditation, is now open attention meditation. And in that, we open ourselves to the sights and sounds of the world around us, and we pay attention to what's going on outside us. So we reactivate our sensory apparatus, as it were, and this corresponds to a movement outwards, whereas the previous variety of meditation corresponds to a movement inwards. And this movement outwards can eventually go as far as a contemplation of the universe as a whole, and as a exercise of realizing our relatedness with the universe as a whole. And this is what I think Pierre Hadot is describing when he talks about the exercise of the view from above, where we start, when we're particularly plagued by oppressive thoughts and we're thinking that we're in a very bad state. Well, we imagine ourselves floating upwards, high above our own individual lives. We examine our material circumstances, our house and our home, and we pull back further to see our neighborhood, our city, our geographical area, our province, our state, our country, and so forth, until we get up imaginatively to a perspective that embraces the earth as a whole, perhaps even further than that. And one of the things that happens there is that we relativize our own little problems. We see that they are not perhaps so serious as we think they are. And this is it brings about a kind of shift of perception, which is, I think, the essence of spiritual exercises on the whole, the shift of perspective as well. A relativization of our own importance as this isolated, egocentric being that we usually consider ourselves to be, who usually considers that the world revolves around us. Well, an exercise like the view from above is intended to show to us that that's not true. The world does not revolve around us, but we are nevertheless not an insignificant part of the universe. We are related to the universe, and therefore we're not isolated at all, like we usually think we are. So I think that once again, there are, and I argued in the paper that you mentioned that there might be signs of Socrates recommending this type of procedure, this more open type of procedure, in some of the satires of Aristophanes. So this is, I mean, that paper was extremely speculative, but I think it's just another example of what we've been talking about, which are these kind of interesting parallels between Greek and Oriental thought. And I think that, as I said, I don't think all of them can be explained by contact between ancient Greeks and ancient Oriental civilizations. I think it has to do with the independent discovery of simple facts about the human organism and the human neurophysiological system.
Yes, thanks. Very interesting. And one more question about this cross-cultural ties, maybe real in this particular case. since we are talking about this, it's not related to practices, but nevertheless, what do you think about the story in Diogenes Laertius about Pyrrho the skeptic, who allegedly in Greek tois gymnosophistais and India sumixei, and borrowed from them the epoche, main principle of skeptical philosophy? Could there really be such an influence? How do you think?
Yeah, I think that I think it's perfectly possible that there may have been. Now, of course, one can wonder exactly how that would have happened. Presumably, Pyrrho accompanied the troops of Alexandria in their Indian expedition. They would have had to have translators who were capable of communicating in between Greek and whatever Indian language was being spoken at the time. I guess some translators must have existed. It's hard to imagine how Alexander could have organized his campaign if he had no means of contacting with the native peoples. And so I don't think it's hard to imagine that, sure, why Pyrrho was a thinking man. Why would he not be interested in talking with his intellectual counterparts in India? And if he was able to communicate successfully, why would he not have been influenced by these ideas? Now, I know some of my esteemed colleagues who are more experts in the history of skepticism than I sort of poo-poo that idea, but there are pretty close parallels in some ways to certain schools of Buddhism and certain aspects of the philosophy of Pyrrho as we know it. So I think that this kind of skeptical current in Greek thought, which I think is ultimately could be linked to a broader current that includes not just skepticism, but what I've called elsewhere epistemic modesty, could somehow be linked to to Oriental sources, which also had an influence on Islam, I believe. And by epistemic modesty, I simply mean the doctrine that's attested from way, way back in the beginnings of Greek thought, for as far as we have records, which claim that there are limits to what we can know. Human beings are constituted so that we can know a fair amount about our environments and the world that we have contact with every day, but the human cognitive system may not be designed to have knowledge of ultimate reality. And so, therefore, we should be modest in our contentions about the nature of that ultimate reality. And I think that this attitude appears not only in skepticism, but also in a school of medicine known as the empiricists, a school which was known to Galen, who transmitted his fragments, but then sort of disappeared from the map, and none of the writings of the empiricists have survived. But I think that throughout Greek thought, and throughout Islamic thought as well, because the Muslims were very familiar with the works of Galen, there was this current of epistemic modesty, which stated that perhaps our rational faculties, great as they are, may not be capable of understanding every aspect of experience. And in Islam, we find these notions developed into the more provocative position, which is shown in Sufism, for instance, which show that not only are there alternative means of knowing reality to reason, but reason is not even very high on the hierarchy. There are other faculties of immediate perception by which we can know divine reality, for instance, and ultimate reality, and they are much higher in value than mere reason. And interestingly, I found that one of the expressions for this state of supra-rational perception, if you will, one way that we can perceive the divine light, according to Avicenna, for instance, is by something called mushahada, which means first-person witnessing. And it's very interesting to me that mushahada is precisely the way the the Arabs translated a work by Galen on empirical thought, where it translates the Greek term for first-person observation, which was a key concept for the empiricists. The empiricist physicists said that the only thing we can rely on is our own first-person experience. There's no sense arguing about hidden causes for phenomena because we can never know them. But one of the 3 or 4 most reliable pillars of thought, the basis of all our theories, must be first-person observation. And it's precisely the same word that we later find in Islamic mystical literature, in Avicenna, for instance, as being the mode of thought by which we can perceive God.
And can you please repeat which term in Greek it is?
The first person, the faculty by which we perceive, yes. Gosh, it doesn't come to me right now. I'm afraid I have to look that up. I can only remember the Arabic equivalent, mushahad. I'll have to look that up.
Okay.
But anyway, for me, that raises the very interesting question of to what extent is objective knowledge, even positivistic knowledge, compatible with what we call mysticism. Generally, as you said, people who emphasize the importance of objective knowledge, of empirical knowledge, the positivists, in other words, want to say that that's the only valid mode of knowledge, only that which can be experimentally confirmed by observation is worth counting as knowledge. And yet, this same term is used by Avicenna and other Islamic mystics to designate what we would call mysticism, or peak knowledge of peak experience. So now this brings us back to Wittgenstein. To what extent is mystical insight, mystical knowledge, and objectivity, empirical knowledge, but perhaps they might not be mutually exclusive after all. Perhaps they're complementary instead. Yeah,
a very interesting subject. Let's for some time back to the spiritual exercises and talk a little about the critics of concept of PVL, philosophy as a way of life, and spiritual exercises. For example, such a prominent scholar as late John Cooper wrote in his book Pursuits of Wisdom, I believe. He wrote that Hadot anachronistically extended the concept of spiritual exercises, which in John Cooper's view concerned exclusively Neoplatonism, extended to the entire ancient philosophy. And as he writes, I quoted, in one passage of his On Anger, Seneca cites the nightly practice of self-examination of one's day's behavior as something particular to a certain Sextius, a now obscure Roman teacher of philosophy at Rome in the reign of Augustus. This citation is evidence of the novelty of such a practice at Seneca's time. So even if Seneca does refer to the daily bedtime examination of conscience with approval, saying that he adopts it himself, the passage counts not in favor of, but against Hadot's idea that such practices were common or standard even in the Hellenistic schools, and much less in the ancient philosophy as a whole, from Socrates' time or even earlier. What could you say to this critique?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting example because it points out a particular technique of the positivist approach to questions not only in Greek philosophy, but also in Greek religion, and for that matter, in science as well, which claims that, since we don't have many written accounts of this practice, then that means well, they didn't exist. Well, sorry, but absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And the fact is that as you know, in both Greek and Latin literature, we possess only the slightest vestiges of a vast, 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 vast amount of literature that is lost. So it's simply methodologically illegitimate to assume that just because we have a limited number of attestations of a specific practice, that means that somehow it never occurred. Well, no, that's just not the case. And in this particular case, it seems very unlikely that Seneca is the one to invent this practice when we think of the fact that it occurs in the Pythagorean golden verses, which repeats that we should not close our eyes before going thrice over everything we have done over the day. Now, we can't precisely date these so-called Pythagorean golden verses. They might be a complete invention ex nihilo from late antiquity, but they might not be. And there's no reason to believe, since Pythagoras wrote nothing, I see no reason whatsoever to rule out the possibility and even the probability that that was indeed a Pythagorean precept. And if so, then it goes back to the 6th century BC. And the fact that it wasn't written down is irrelevant to whether or not it existed or not.
Yeah, thanks. But nevertheless, if we speak about spiritual exercises in general and in relation to all philosophical schools of antiquity or of Hellenistic time, it seems to me that in some philosophical schools we can find very few traces of spiritual exercises.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. For example, if we believe that the main goal of spiritual exercises is metanoia and ultimately the achievement of cosmic consciousness, then these criteria are quite suitable for Stoicism. But however, can we say the same, for example, about Aristotle or Epicurus?
Mm-hmm.
Are there any signs of cosmic consciousness, for example, in their philosophical schools?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, good question. I think there are. They're not going to be identical, of course, because the thinkers that you mentioned have very different conceptions of what the cosmos is and the way that it's arranged. But when we think of Aristotle, we can think of the advice he gives us in the book 10 of the Nicomachean Ethics, for instance, that we should pursue, given the principle that when an intellect thinks of an intelligible substance, according to Aristotle, it becomes identical with that substance. Then what we should do is arrive at a position, at a situation in which we can intelligize these immaterial substances, which are, of course, for Aristotle, the unmoved movers. And that if we do that, well, we become identical with them. And there's an extent to which we can become immortal by that way. And these ideas were developed by the strict peripatetic commentator Alexander of Ephesus. So this kind of, and it led to the very influential medieval doctrine of the conjunction with the aged intellect. And that is, I think, as has been argued by Philippe Merlon, nothing other than a mystical experience. And a mystical experience that once it has happened, changes us, not just in the fact that it makes us think in a different way, but it literally makes us immortal in later exegesis of Aristotle's thought. And so I think Aristotelian contemplation, theoria, is awfully close to some kind of a cosmic consciousness. And Aristotle writes that because of our human limitations, as we are now, these states of theoria cause us the greatest happiness that we can know on earth. The gods have that state always. We have it only once in a while. But Aristotle's immediate successors went on to say, well, if we can have that experience due to the principle of the identification between the subject and the object, in the case of intelligible, the cognition of intelligibles, if we can manage to cognize these separate intellects, we can become identical with them. Therefore, we can become omniscient, and we can become immortal. And that is identical with many medieval accounts of mysticism, what happens in a mystical experience. As far as the Epicureans are concerned, well, when you look at some of the praises of the cosmos that we find in Lucretius, for instance, it looks as though he has something very, very much in common with a cosmic consciousness. The contemplation of the universe for Lucretius allows our mind to go soaring beyond the bounds of the cosmos. And it can clearly have an aesthetic impact. He writes in one passage of on the nature of things about what it would be like if we saw the world. We had never seen the world before, and suddenly we saw the world for the first time. What would that be like? What emotions would we feel? How astonished would we be by the beauty of the cosmos? That, I think, is almost indisputably a spiritual exercise. It's a thought experiment which transforms the way we look at it. If we think in that terms, if we think of how beautiful the world would look to us if we saw it for the first time, that exercise can transform us, and it can help us to appreciate the beauty of our surroundings, of the natural world, and bring us to a state in which we can see it as if for the first time. Tam quam spectator novis, as Seneca says. So yeah, I think that, and remember that one of the discoveries that most influenced Pierre Hadot was the fact that in these two Hellenistic schools of Stoicism and Epicureanism, so violently opposed on almost everything, they spent most of their time polemicizing with each other. And yet they both recommend a spiritual exercise like concentration on the present. They give vastly different theoretical justifications to this practice, but they wind up recommending basically the same thing. Don't worry so much about the past. Don't worry so much about the future. Concentrate on the present moment, and realize how the wonderful beauties and uniquenesses and grace that it contains. And I think that this was the main observation that led Hadot to perhaps what is one of his most controversial ideas, and one of the ones that people like John Cooper reject the most vehemently, which is that ultimately what's basic in ancient philosophy are precisely these spiritual exercises, and with their therapeutic goals. They're intended to make us better. They're intended to heal us from our unhappiness. And for Hadot, in a sense, that's what's fundamental. And later on, as these schools, philosophical schools, seek to compete with each other, to justify their own philosophies against each other, well, they come up with theoretical justifications for these spiritual exercises, which are very, very different and contradictory. But for Hadot, to an extent, these superstructures, these theoretical superstructures, these metaphysical systems which explain the world and thereby justify these exercises, are secondary. And if we, as citizens of the 21st century, are interested in reactualizing some of these spiritual exercises, that's an argument for the position that, to a certain extent, and with a great deal of care, we can almost ignore the metaphysical background of these exercises. And that justifies what Hadot, another point that people object to about Hadot, is that he justifies eclecticism. He sees no reason why we shouldn't take a few elements from Stoicism and a few elements from Epicureanism and Platonism and Aristotelianism and skepticism, and integrate them into our worldview. He thinks eclecticism has gotten a bad name, and he quotes Nietzsche in this regard, who speaks of the entire history of Greek philosophy as a kind of experimental laboratory, which gives us the results of centuries of spiritual and philosophical inquiries. And we are free to use those results the way we want.
Yeah, it's great. Let's talk a little about philosophy in general, since precisely these reasons that you just described, yes, that antiquity is a melting pot from which all people can take different modes of thinking and of different technet view. Yes, my question is about your words in papers that I already mentioned, that in book of essays in honor of Pierre Hadot, you write that the deprofessionalization of philosophy strikes you as a positive development. So a couple of years, 10 years, I believe, passed since the publication of this collection of articles, and a lot has happened during these years related to the deprofessionalization and popularization of ancient philosophy. And first of all, I think the global movement of modern Stoicism has grown, and I see your comments in Facebook group on modern Stoicism, which consists of more than 100,000 people. And very often we can find there superficial or erroneous interpretations of Stoicism or ancient philosophy in general. And same poor impression is made by a lot of books on ancient self-help, which appeared in recent years. In other words, what I want to say is that such popularization and deprofessionalization is often fraught with very superficial reading of ancient philosophy. So, do you still think that the deprofessionalization of philosophy is a positive development?
Yeah, that's you hit the nail right on the head with a very difficult question. Yeah, and I think that the problem basically concerns here the very, very difficult problem of this kind of updating of ancient philosophy, which I've spoken of a little bit here. What aspects? Obviously, we can't, if we want to make the precepts of Greco-Roman philosophy interesting and useful for today, we can't accept them hook, line, and sinker. We cannot accept every aspect of these ancient thought systems because simply they contain things that we don't believe anymore. They're all based, they take for granted that the inferiority of women, for instance, they take for granted the idea that slavery is a natural state and is not a bad thing at all, etc., etc., etc. So, and of course, the cosmological beliefs that they are based on, to a certain extent, are also outdated. So we have to do some updating. We have to, as Pierre Hadot said, leave aside certain outmoded aspects of these thought systems that we're trying to reactualize. But the very, very difficult question is, what can we leave out and what can we not leave out? And that is, in my view, the source of some of the problems that you mentioned. For instance, in the modern Stoicism movement, one often sees interpretations of Marcus Aurelius, very, very probably the most popular superstar in the Neo-Stoic movement, as preaching a doctrine of basically, well, I'm going to do what I want, and I don't care what anybody else thinks. And that's about it. So we have a couple of memes of Marcus Aurelius that are circulating on the internet. There's an awful lot of phony ones as well, of course, but they're taken out of context and they're raised to the status of a principle of life. So I'm going to do what I wanted. My own opinions are what matters, and I don't have to care about anybody else's opinion, and that's that. Well, but that means the most charitable explanation of a view like that would be that the people who say that are taking a tiny fragment of Marxist thought and are separating it from the other parts. In Stoicism, we have a unity between, in the triple discipline of Marcus Aurelius, that Pierre Hadot has studied, we have, on the one hand, the discipline of thoughts, where we're supposed to ensure the objectivity of our thoughts. We've talked about that already. Then we have the discipline of desire, which implies that we should learn to accept the things that don't depend on us because they come to us from an ultimately providential and beneficent nature, which is in some sense very closely connected with our own most essential being. And finally, there's the third aspect, which is the discipline of tendency or actions, and that pertains to ethics. And that implies that all our actions must be directed toward the benefit of the human community. We are inseparable parts of mankind, and all human beings, and that to that extent are deeply related to us. So it's impermissible and dangerous, I think, to leave out an entire field like ethics, which is what a lot of modern Stoics do. They say, no, well, this is just a philosophy that justifies me for doing whatever I feel like. Well, no, because there are not only, Stoicism is not only about freedom, it's also about responsibility. We have a responsibility to our freedom, to our fellow human beings. We have a responsibility to act socially with a view to the improvement of the human good. And it's dangerous to leave that out. So
Yeah.
that's it. It's a very, very difficult and tricky point to realize what precisely can we leave out and what can we not leave out from an ancient philosophical thought system.
Good point. And for me, one of the main dangers of popular ancient philosophy, of popular versions of modern Stoicism, is some kind of decomposition of philosophy into a set of certain practices or techniques or spiritual exercises, if you wish. For example, in the case of modern Stoicism, it may be a dichotomy of control, praemeditatio malorum, and so on. Because I have edited many Russian translations of Western books on modern Stoicism. And in some of them, for me, it is very difficult to see the philosophy behind these practices. Have you ever had the same feeling in connection with modern Stoicism, as if this is not a coherent, interconnected philosophical system that encompasses a person's entire life, but only a set of discrete psychological practices?
Yeah, absolutely. And that is this kind of, as I've said, this kind of reactualization, this kind of updating of ancient thought is necessary to make it relevant to people today. But when it's done in a kind of a, what shall I say, a way that's too rapid, when you sort of just do a Google Marcus Aurelius and come up with a few detached statements from the Meditations and try to put together some kind of a system out of that, well, that doesn't usually bring very satisfactory results and can wind up leaving out very important features and can wind up being a travesty of ancient thought. It's interesting that the same problem, or a very analogous problem, is raised by mindfulness. Mindfulness meditation is, of course, reactualization and updating of an ancient Buddhist practice. And there again, if one wants to make these Buddhist doctrines useful for contemporary society, you can't simply adopt wholesale all the Buddhist doctrines and expect contemporary Western society to adopt them. So something has to be left out and things have to be changed. Now, what is left out and what is changed is what's key. One often finds, for instance, in many popular mindfulness texts, this emphasis on the self. One has to love the self. It's repeated over and over again that you have to love yourself first before you can share your love with anyone else. This is always presented without the slightest shred of an argument. It's by no means clear to me why that would be the case, and I'd like to see some argumentation about that. But and it's also rather dangerous, I think, when mindfulness gurus continually remind us that we're perfect just the way we are. I can't help thinking, well, for instance, if this is a podcast or some kind, people listening to that podcast might include people who like to torture children to death. Now, they're being told that they're perfect just the way they are? I don't think so. And in fact, for me, that attitude, you're perfect just the way you are, is anathema to philosophy. I share Pierre Hadot's view that what philosophy is about is a kind of perfectionism, in the sense that our goal should be to try to become better all the time, all our life long. We'll never become perfect, but we should strive to get better all the time. And when one neglects that aspect, whether it's Buddhism or Stoicism or anything else, and simply transforms it into a kind of a comforting pat on the head for saying you're fine the way you are, don't worry about all those people, what those other people say. I think that's dangerous. I think it's counterproductive, and I think it's anathema to philosophy.
Yeah, thanks. So some final questions. How do you think the concept of philosophy of life will it develop and exist as an alternative to the analytical and continental tradition? I mean, does the PVL is just a temporary fashion, or does it remind you of living traditions that will continue to develop within the walls of university and beyond?
Mm-hmm. I'm hopeful. I think there are good signs. There are now several networks of people interested in PWL, philosophy as a way of life, and they're somewhat scattered, spread throughout the world. But we do have group projects and people who are interested from basically all over the world, not just in Russia. I gave a talk last year at the the Fudan University of Shanghai, which an online stream which was attended by over 1,000 people. There is activity in Japan. There's interest in Latin America. There's interest in Europe. It's Australia. It's becoming still a scattered, but nevertheless a global phenomenon. And I think that that's very positive. The other thing that I'm hopeful for is that it's now gradually being extended to other modes of thought. So we have studies now underway, or that will be done in the future, about comparative studies between philosophy as a way of life and Buddhism and Islam and various strains of Chinese thought, Jewish thought. These kind of interdisciplinary studies, I think, are very, very promising, and they should be extended. I gave a talk 2 days ago here at the University of Victoria, and someone in the audience said, well, why shouldn't we compare philosophy as a way of life as embodied in Greco-Roman philosophy with the thought of indigenous Native Americans? And I thought, that's a wonderful idea. That should absolutely be done. And why not indigenous thought throughout the world? Why should this not be a global enterprise of comparative thought? And then, of course, there's the aspect that we mentioned before, this link with contemplative studies. I hope to pursue this with my colleague Marc-Henri de Roche of the University of Kyoto, who's also interested in this factor. So in other words, the neurophysiological study of the effects of some of these spiritual exercises, that can be extended and done in more depth. So I think there are a lot of very positive things on the horizon now. There is another problem here, which is that Pierre Hadot had very critical things to say about the role of the university in the historical development, or rather the historical decline of philosophy as a way of life. Basically, his view was that if philosophy as a way of life was characteristic of ancient thought until, I don't know, at least the end of the classical antiquity in the 5th or 6th centuries of our era, and then declined gradually, the ultimate reason for that decline was, on the one hand, Christianity, and on the other hand, the rise of the universities, which is precisely very closely coordinated with the dominance of Christianity. And for Hadot, as we all recall, his famous characterization of university philosophy study is as a factory in which for producing more philosophy professors. So the ultimate question we have to face is it possible to teach philosophy as a way of life in a university environment, or is there not some basically inimical relationship between philosophy as a way of life and university study of philosophy? After all, Hadot emphasized that many of the contemporary philosophers who have sort of kept alive this tradition have been extra university people like Spinoza, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard. These people, not uncoincidentally, were not university figures.
Mm-hmm.
So there's this tension between academicization and philosophy as a way, and this kind of what you've mentioned, the desirable democratization of philosophy, opening it up, making it relevant, not just to people with degrees in philosophy, but to the so-called man or woman in the street. I think that has happened so far, and that's one of the developments that Pierre Hadot most appreciated, and that has continued after his death, and that is that Hadot is read not just by professional philosophers, but by nurses and doctors and feminists and environmentalists and people in management studies and people in every kind of discipline under the earth. And I think that that's an essential part to keep up, and we cannot allow ourselves to get too academicized. And that implies that we have to avoid what Pierre Hadot characterized as the tendency for university professors to hear themselves speak. University professors like and semi-university professors like me, we like to hear ourselves talk, and we like to be able to express things in a fancy, eloquent way. And that often leads to us using some kind of a jargon that excludes the vast majority of people who have not had the leisure or the financial means or time to undertake university studies in philosophy. So we have to be careful of that tendency. We don't want this to become just some kind of an in-group talk, a kind of an old boys club of people who know Pierre Hadot by heart and know the terminology and the jargon, and we can talk about details, points of exegesis, whereas we lose sight of what's important to people men and women who have to work for a living and have quite other concerns. We should never allow ourselves to lose touch with the people with whom Pierre Hadot was most concerned, and that is working men and women.
Yeah, it's very important, and unfortunately, in Russia we have not very much studies on PWL, so we have something to work on. And maybe last question about you as a practitioner. Can you describe yourself as a person who is engaged in a practice of spiritual exercises and trying to get closer to the mentioned cosmic consciousness? And if so, how do you assess your progress on this path?
My progress is very unsatisfactory. I am not as assiduous a practitioner as I should be. I don't always use, for instance, we mentioned the doctrine of having a pause before reacting. I often don't do that. I often react too quickly and allow myself to be triggered by things I read or on the internet or things that are said to me in public. I forget at that time about the necessity for taking a pause before reacting. So I still have a very great deal to learn. And I think that one thing that I don't do enough, because of the obligations of an academic's life, is that I don't go back and read Pierre Hadot, and I don't go back and read the ancient works that he cites as often as I should. Every time I do, I'm refreshed and I say, oh my God, I had forgotten about that. And look at myself, look at what I've been doing. I've been neglecting that aspect of Pierre Hadot's teachings in my recent behavior. But I can think of when I always think back to a paradigmatic moment for me, which was when I was a student in Paris. I had to apply every year to get my papers renewed. And one year, it occurred to the authorities to have every student in Paris go through the same office at the prefecture. And that meant that there were 3-day lineups on the sidewalk. You literally had to spend 3 days in line, and for the privilege of talking to the police and getting your papers in order. And at the time, I was reading Pierre Hadot's. I had an off-print of Pierre Hadot's "Only the Present is Our Happiness," and I was reading it throughout those 3 days. And I found that it helped. Not only did it help me deal with the present situation, a rather unpleasant situation, but it helped me become more compassionate with people around me. And instead of concentrating on how often this is and how dare they do this to me and what an indignity this is, I found myself becoming more concerned with the people around me, helping some of the people, the other potential immigrants and refugees who couldn't even fill out the forms because they didn't read French. So I helped them as much as I could. So in the best circumstances, I continue to believe that the works of Pierre Hadot in general, and in particular, and the study of ancient works on writings on spiritual exercises in general, can be of a definite benefit to us, not just in making us calm or feel better, but in making us, to a certain extent, better persons. And that the more we study these ancient texts, the more of a positive effect these people can have. These texts can have. That said, as I say, I have a long way to go. I'm comforted by Hadot's remark about Goethe and his study of reading. Goethe, who announced that at the age of 80, he thought he was just beginning to get the hang of how to read.
Yeah, great quote. So, Michael, thank you for this discussion. It was a great pleasure to talk with you. Thank you for your work and for your translations of Pierre Hadot. It is very important for Russian readers too. Thanks and goodbye. I can send you a YouTube link to our conversation when I publish it on our YouTube of Moscow Stoa.
Okay.
And I can, if you can read Russian, when I decipher our conversation and translate in Russian before I publish it, I can too send it to you if you would like to read.
I'll have a look at it. I think it would take me. My Russian reading is rather slow, so it would probably take me too much time to go over it in any detail. But I'd be glad to have a look at it.
Okay.
And I'd like to say, in turn, that I think what you're doing is extremely important given the world conjuncture right now, the world political situation. I think that your series of interviews with scholars from around the world is extraordinarily important, and you are to be congratulated for your undertaking.
Thanks a lot for warm words. Thanks. Bye and good luck.
Thanks. Good luck to you too.